I'm telling you now, if you're still getting your latest news from the traditional mainstream media, then it's not news. It's not investigation in search of the truth. As far as I'm concerned, it's a limp attempt by outfits compromised by complicity with years of misuse of the people, desperate to find a quiet off-ramp from the road to hell they've been enthusiastically barrelling along. Even now, with everyone getting so excited watching rats running for the lifeboats, the mainstream media is still working within the same old narrative, still talking about masks for school children and testing for COVID-19, still asking the questions we already know the answers to. How can it be that after all this time, the mainstream media is still failing to ask the most important questions about so much that happened? After all this time, how can they still miss the open goal so completely? A person might say it's down to more of that good old willful blindness. After all, for the vast majority of the mainstream media, they're looking at journalistic credibility as a vanishing dot in the rearview mirror. Having spent the past 2 and more years performing as unquestioning foghorns for the government narrative, the time for them to remember that the job of the Fourth Estate is to challenge authority is long, long past, never to be regained. Give the devils their due. All those years, the years of the bungs from the hundreds of millions of pounds spent by the government and Bill Gates and others to ensure a warm welcome and happy hosting for the official narrative of lockdowns and masks saving lives, of safe and effective medical procedures and all that jazz, were surely enough to leave many so-called news organisations punch drunk and suffering double or even triple vision when it came to keeping a beady eye on that pesky matter of the truth. And still, after all the demonstrable catastrophic harms of lockdown, after all those lives and livelihoods ruined, all those dodgy contracts, the greatest transfer of wealth in history from the poor to the billionaires, the excess deaths mounting and as unexplained as ever, after all that, and in lieu of real investigation, we get speculation about whether Matt Hancock ordered enough tests before sending the elderly into care homes, about who did or didn't want to close schools. Is that really the best they can do? Let's once again, once more and with feeling, contemplate some of the list of questions so many journalists still won't ask. The answers we can only assume they simply don't care to hear. If the politicians were so scared in the face of the images coming out of China in 2019, then why didn't they listen objectively and reasonably to all of the science? What about the Great Barrington Declaration? Instead of ignoring all those experts and dismissing their appeal for another way of handling things, might it not have been appropriate to listen and ask questions? And what about the doctors all around the world who examined their patients with COVID-19, recognised it as a respiratory virus and quickly identified cheap, readily available and effective ways to treat them? During the first part of 2020, in the US, in Europe and in Africa, doctors were treating their patients in the way they're supposed to, which is to say, looking at the person in front of them and addressing the symptoms with on-label and off-label medicines with tried and tested safety records and proof of efficacy. Those doctors were sharing information with anyone who would listen, trying, mostly in vain, to publish scientific papers detailing their findings in supposedly serious medical journals about how their treatments were saving thousands of lives without hospitalisation and in advance of any so-called vaccines. But instead of listening to them, instead of taking them seriously, or at least asking questions, governments in those countries and around the world and the play-along mainstream media went out of their way to ridicule and ban those medicines, to strike off those doctors and to shut down and censor anyone at all from so much as talking about them. Where was the Telegraph newspaper and the rest of the mainstream media when all that was going on? Where were the questions about whether or not COVID-19 was readily treatable with available drugs? What was on the front pages then? Lockdown and face masks for all, Scotch eggs, one-way paths round supermarkets and the rule of 6, the nonsense and fear porn that ruined us. That's what. If governments and the mainstream media following the science, as they called it, were so desperate to fight COVID-19, then why did they silence experienced and highly credentialed medical professionals with potentially life-saving information to offer? Why is it still to this day close to forbidden to talk about drugs like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine? Why are the vast majority of the world's populations still kept in the dark about how many doctors saw at once that apart from anything else, they were dealing with a respiratory virus and knew from the medical training all doctors receive that a respiratory virus like COVID-19 was to be treated with available antiviral drugs with anti-inflammatory drugs, and when things got more serious, with anti-thrombotic drugs. Why was that not a conversation on every front page? On this show, I interviewed Dr. Shankara Chetty from South Africa, who personally treated thousands of COVID patients with, among other available on-label medicines, antihistamines, and saved all those lives without hospitalisation. Dr. Chetty was invited to Malaysia to share his knowledge, and doctors there, following his protocol, saved many thousands more lives. He was the recipient of an award from the Malaysian government for his efforts. Why didn't we hear about him here? Why weren't the mainstream media asking about his successful life-saving efforts? I've spoken at length with Dr. Pierre Corey, an esteemed critical care physician in the US, one of many, who advocated the use of off-label medicines for COVID-19. Why was he bluntly shut down instead of being listened to? Where were the investigative journalists to objectively investigate what he was saying? Front pages and chatter now about whether or not Matt Hancock bothered to ensure enough testing of the elderly before they entered care homes. That's not the question. The question is, how were the elderly with COVID actually treated in those care homes? Indeed, how exactly were people with COVID treated in hospitals and elsewhere? Was it the right treatment? That is a crucial question that still goes unasked. And why did so many people die here in this country when patients under the care of doctors like Shankara Chetty and Pierre Corey recovered without the need of going to hospital? Why don't we know more about all of this? Another doctor or scientist might say treatment with those off-label and on-label antiviral drugs, anti-inflammatories and anti-thrombotics and antihistamines posed risks. Maybe so, but risks were also posed by the so-called vaccines and other new products like remdesivir that were available later in the pandemic. Research carried out by Pfizer made plain the company was well aware in advance of the rollout of the risk of adverse effects related to their so-called vaccines. And yet governments around the world indemnified those makers, which is to say those governments accepted that if any harm was done to people, resulting in the need for compensation, then the taxpayers would foot the bill. Why so ready to take risks with so-called vaccines and to wash the hands of the makers in advance when it came to experimental gene therapies labelled as vaccines? But an outright ban on using existing drugs with decades of proven safety and efficacy. Why? And most importantly right now, in the context of supposed revelations about what went on in care homes, why are so many journalists still not asking those same straightforward questions? Why were elderly people in care homes suffering with COVID and having breathing difficulties given opiates and benzodiazepines? Those patients had a respiratory virus. Might they not have got better if treated with other drugs? And here's another question for the mainstream media. The so-called vaccines are quietly being withdrawn as well. Have you noticed? Why is that? When, according to a headline in The Lancet on the 14th of January this year, the COVID pandemic is far from over. If the pandemic is far from over and the so-called vaccines are the best answer, as we are told over and over, where have those products gone? And why no investigation of that by journalists? If they were safe and effective for the under-50s a few weeks and months ago, why are they no longer available for that age group now? Surely that's an interesting development. Why aren't we hearing more about it? Seems to me we're being prescribed something else now, a giant dose of amnesia. After 3 years of catastrophic harms to ways of life, to economies, to children, apparently it's now time to forget so much of what happened, or at least to consign it all to history. After all, nowadays we've got war, climate crisis, and 15-minute cities and drag queen story time to contemplate on a round-the-clock basis. There's to be a COVID inquiry. Of course there is. I wonder which company will get the contract for all the whitewash. What's happening now is spectacularly unedifying. All manner of characters suddenly keen to talk about Matt Hancock and tests and face masks, not to mention millions of words of WhatsApp messages, are the same ones that for months on end bellowed about locking down earlier, harder and for longer, the same ones that wanted a mask on every face, including those of children and infants, the same that wanted mandated injections with those new medical products, the same ones that celebrated the need to cancel Christmas before jetting off to enjoy their holidays in Antigua or the Med. The same ones that took to writing miles of newspaper columns about how those law-abiding, tax-paying fellow citizens, preferring, as was their right, not to receive those medical products, should face all manner of punishment, consequences and retribution. Those same characters, in print and on screen, are suddenly positioning themselves to celebrate the downfall of the very people whose draconian, unlawful, shameful actions they were such hearty cheerleaders for just 5 minutes ago. But if they've got selective memories, then thankfully millions of us do not. We remember every word, tweet and moment of screen time. Better yet, we kept the receipts. Every bug-eyed, white-lipped call for lockdown. Every feverish demand to see the so-called COVIDiots, granny killers, COVID deniers and anti-vaxxers locked up or worse. It's all still there. A permanent record of what I would describe as the most shameful dereliction of duty by any generation of so-called journalists. It's well known and admitted that the population of this country was subjected to propaganda and psychological manipulation. Let's have some questions about why that happened. In my opinion, lockdowns caused untold damage and were a mistake. We know now that the masks were pointless, even the much vaunted N95s. Why aren't we asking questions about that? Who decided the people should be stifled, our questions and dissent silenced and brainwashed instead? We must remember that that's what happened and demand to know why. And here's the thing, if we were manipulated, silenced and censored to stop us asking questions about COVID-19, why should we think for 1 minute that those same characters are telling us the truth about anything else? About the war in Ukraine, about climate, about digital IDs and central bank digital currencies, about the compromised World Health Organization? Will we go along with plans to let the WHO call the next pandemic and lay down the laws we'll all be ordered to obey? Is that another so-called conspiracy theory? You know, the sort of conspiracy theory that comes true eventually, like so many others. Why aren't they asking questions about all of this? Because we are. As the saying goes, after all, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. That's my opinion. Of course it is, and you're free to disagree with me. Keep your tweets and emails coming all through the show. You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk and you can tweet me as well at gbnews, and I'll try to get to some of your comments later in the show. I'm joined by filmmaker and director